So like I mentioned, I'm just going to state this right up front that this first webinar is really focused on the Iowa Hazelnut Project, really Iowa geography, and then the joint performance trials and on-farm research sites that we're hosting through our on-farm collaborators. And incidentally, we're always looking for more growers, but more on that just a little bit later. So if you're interested in different aspects, we will get there. Just be patient with us. Next week, we're going to have the hazelnut primer, basically the good, the bad, and the ugly. And during this webinar, we're going to get down to some of the nitty gritty of what hazelnuts are, the differences between European, American beaked hybrids, so on and so forth. And I thought my slide was supposed to move. There we go. Excellent. Okay, so it's worth taking just a moment to set the stage and provide some context for the development of the Iowa Hazelnut Project. So this program of the Iowa Nut Growers Association is made possible by a much larger USDA Specialty Crops Research Initiative grant that was applied for through the University of Minnesota in collaboration with the University of Wisconsin, Jason Fishbach and his team up there. And so the group from the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative, I know that's a mouthful to say. We call it UMDI for short, UMHDI. So they applied like 2 or 3 times before finally being awarded this specialty crops grant in 2019. Now, this larger grant has many different components, and they're looking at breeding and micropropagation work, harvesting and processing research. It includes learning groups that are networked between the states. And so that's why the Iowa Nut Growers Association took on the lead effort in Iowa to accomplish those tasks. And then the Iowa Hazelnut Project was launched. So the goal of the Iowa Hazelnut Project is to accelerate hazelnuts in Iowa sustainably. And I want to stress the sustainability portion of that goal. So if I was with you in the room right now, I would ask for a raise of hands to see who was involved with or familiar with the case of a quote unquote new crop in the past, Jerusalem artichokes. And for those who are not familiar, real quickly, Jerusalem artichokes were promoted and touted as the next greatest thing and a crop for farmers looking to diversify with an additional crop, and you could get rich at the same time. Well, suffice to say, it was a failure, and many farmers lost tons of money and time because there was not a market for Jerusalem artichokes. Now, if we fast forward to the 21st century, we see this explosion of another new crop called aronia berries. And I remember going to my first aronia berry conference, maybe 2015 or 16, give or take a year or two, and I was blown away both the number of growers that already had plants in the ground, but then growers that were interested in putting in more plants. And so we're talking 8, 10, 15, 20 acres of these aronia berries. I mean, it was crazy. And I asked almost every one of them where they were looking to market their berries, and almost everyone to a T replied something akin to, well, maybe they weren't sure yet, but they wanted to get plants in the ground. They didn't want to miss this opportunity. They could always sell them directly to consumers or at the farmers market if needed, or they tell me that they're lined up with this or that outfit and they're going to buy everything I can grow. Naturally, I probed a little bit to see if I could find what the terms of some of these contracts essentially were that were being offered. And to my horror, I discovered that it was almost entirely on basically a handshake and a prayer. And if you're not familiar with aronia berries today and the status of that industry, let me tell you, it's rough. I mean, many people have been burned by actors promising to buy berries and then either not taking them or worse, taking them and then not paying for them. So dozens, if not hundreds, of aronia berry growers have essentially given up and either ripped out their bushes or simply neglected them, allowing animals to graze. Just really don't even care about the berry production. I personally have 2 neighbors within 3 miles of me, and I know of at least 3 others within 30 miles that have completely abandoned the idea of growing aronia berry for profit. And so here's our 2 very kind of parallel stories of new crops, I guess you could say, in Iowa. One was a failure with the Jerusalem artichokes. The other one, aronia berries. Maybe the jury is still out, but it really isn't looking good. So I'm really sensitive to the current situation, leading an effort to develop hazelnuts as a viable woody crop here in the Midwest. And so it's not without its challenges, But I think with research and promotion, we can eventually get there. And what I mean by there is a viable woody crop here in the Midwest that is profitable. I mean, that's the goal. So how do we get there? Well, we have several objectives, as you can see here, that we're working on to achieve this goal and make significant progress towards hazelnuts as a viable woody crop in the Midwest here. And so what we're looking to do with the Iowa Hazelnut Project is lead outreach and learning opportunities, establish those field trials, and then develop some of those value-added opportunities. So the Iowa Nut Growers Association is the primary organization in Iowa working to lead the outreach and learning opportunities to growers. And we have partners like the University of Minnesota and Wisconsin. There's groups like the Arbor Day Foundation. There's research being done by Rutgers, Oregon State University, and others. And we can really provide the most up-to-date information and insight into growing hazelnuts profitably in the Midwest. And a major component of our outreach and learning opportunities is this Hazelnut Academy. And so while we originally planned on hosting these face-to-face learning groups throughout the state, the COVID-19 pandemic had other plans for us. So we quickly transitioned then to this Hazelnut Academy, which is going to allow individuals to learn about hazelnuts and how to grow them, manage, harvest, process, even market their crop to a certain degree, and all from the comfort of their own living room. And so the Hazelnut Academy is also very nice for me because it's kind of a screening tool and a way to teach growers before they ever maybe put a plant in the ground. Maybe what you mentioned, Clayton, just learning and getting as much information as you can so you can make sound decisions on what you plant, where you plant, so on and so forth. And that's, kind of what we're all about here, learning from the mistakes of others and sharing that. And so then associated with the Hazelnut Academy is going to be the development of various fact sheets and guidance documents just to assist growers with getting started and establishing their own hazelnut plantings. So, another component is going to be these replicated joint performance trials and then the smaller on-farm field trials. These are really major components of what we're doing with the Iowa Hazelnut Project. And then, of course, the overall federal specialty crops research grant. So these joint performance trials consist of sites where the leading experimental genotypes, and that's what we call them, genotypes, they're being grown, the data collected. Basically, we're looking at 5 to 12 plants for each genotype in randomized blocks grown under these really specific protocols. And that's kind of important so that we can get a good sense of how these plants do from northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, all the way down through Iowa and Illinois. And then we have these smaller on-farm field trials that really consist of just 5 plants of a specific genotype, still grown under these specific protocols. And then associated with the joint performance trials and the smaller on-farm field trials is this facilitation of on-farm research so that we can gather and then confirm and validate some of these assumptions. And I really want to stress that, confirm and validate these assumptions, because there have been a lot of assumptions made regarding productivity of hazelnuts in the Midwest and thus profitability. And so by collecting this data from tracking establishment costs, right, to tracking shrub flowering and pollination times, yield and productivity info, all of this is absolutely vital in order to really firm up those enterprise worksheets, right? And then validate these really range of assumptions that have been made regarding hazelnuts. And again, if we want to get to profitability, we need to have good data and we need to have solid examples that we can give other growers so that they can be confident that it's going to be successful for them. So one final objective that we're working through is the development of these value-added opportunities. So let's just be honest, in-shell hazelnuts are going to have limited marketability without processing to crack the shell and then get to that delicious kernel. Say if anybody's not muted, could you do me a favor and just mute your microphone? That would be great. That way, if we get a dog barking in the background or something, it won't be a problem. Hazelnut kernels, they really have a range of applications from confections to baked goods to oil production and more. And really, that's what we need to get to when we talk about profitability. It's going to be really tough to get to any sort of profitability with just round little in-shell nuts that we're selling in a wholesale market. And then we need to think of additional opportunities like payments for ecological services like carbon credits, water quality trading, wildlife habitat enhancement, all of these various things. Because one of the challenges, and we'll get to it in one of our later sessions when we're looking at spreadsheets and 20-year financial models and stuff like that, with almost all woody crops, one of the real challenges is these are perennials. And so they're putting growth into their root systems to develop for the long haul. They're not like an annual putting everything into just seed production. And so we have to figure out a way to cash flow without any sort of a production with a lot of these woody crops, whether it's chestnuts, aronia berries, hazelnuts, for the first 3 years, 5 years, maybe 7 years. And so how do we do that? But recognizing at the same time that we are providing these environmental benefits right away with the establishment of these perennial plants and then long into the future. And so if we can marry up and match up some of these folks that are really looking to have really solid projects that they can bank on for the long term, and then we can fill that gap for these growers to cash flow in that short term in those unproductive years. I shouldn't say unproductive years, but when they're not necessarily getting much for production. And of course, part of that factors into the production system. So what can we potentially do within the rows of those hazelnuts, either with an annual crop or something else to maybe supplement some income in those early years when we don't have any production and the plants are growing. So anyways, all of these things are going to be investigated as options to really help contribute to profitability. Well, I better wet my whistle here real quick. And incidentally, if someone does have a question, they can pop in at any time. This is relatively informal. But there'll be a time at the end here too where we can ask questions. And part of what we want to accomplish with this is, especially with Clayton, just talking about what your plans are, what you want to know more about. We can very much use these sessions as a way to just workshop issues that you want to work through as you're learning more about hazelnuts. And for Ed, as a new grower, you're coming into your third year, so we can talk about things to be aware of. You should be starting to get some production here, hopefully, even if it's only a nut or two. Or maybe you've had a couple of your initial nuts, which is always exciting, certainly. So
I had one.
you had a nut last year, your first nut? Cool. Well, I think it's worth it to spend a little time talking through our on-farm field and research trials. Growers are wanted for this on-farm collaboration. We really need to accelerate the industry by testing out some of these experimental genotypes being investigated for wider commercial release, and that's what we call them. You can see the requirements for working with the Iowa Hazelnut, or pardon me, the Nut Growers Association, essentially, to be an on-farm partner. Of course, the work that we do is the Iowa Hazelnut Project, that is a project of the Iowa Nut Growers Association, to delineate that. One of the things is you do need to be an Iowa Nut Growers Association member. You need to complete this Hazelnut Academy. And then we ask folks to submit an application to become an on-farm collaborator and then work with us to develop an appropriate planting, maintenance, and data management plan. And it's important. You might ask, well, why? Why do all these requirements to be a member, to do the academy? You have to understand that the plants that we're dealing with here are very, very valuable because we're trying to get clonal material at all of our joint performance trials and at our on-farm sites. And it's one of the bottlenecks that we'll learn about with hazelnut propagation is being able to scale up plants. Now they've got it figured out in Oregon with their plants, but it's, as we'll learn next week, their plants are very different than our plants. And so there have been some very significant bottlenecks with some of the experimental genotypes that we want to try to replicate and get out there to these on-farm research sites. And so we need to be sure that we're screening growers so that they know what they're doing, so that they have an adequate plan in place, so that we're not just essentially wasting plants that are dying because growers aren't taking care of them or don't have the necessary expertise in some of those things. So getting back to the on-farm field trials here, we want to establish at least one site in each of the different landforms of Iowa. And it's interesting because Iowa has this significant variation from north to south, east to west. And the thought is by establishing these sites throughout Iowa, we're going to be in a really good position to then make future recommendations when it comes to varieties, when some of these experimental genotypes have proven themselves to be called quote unquote varieties, and then where they're going to do best with the next generation of growers wanting to get started. And so this is an exciting time where we're gathering some of that information so that we can provide that to make good, sound decisions to new growers. So, what are some of those different landforms of Iowa? Well, I'm glad you asked, because this next section of our talk is all about the topic. So you can see from this map the landforms of Iowa overlaid on a county map. So you can see where some of the boundaries lie. Again, the goal that we're looking to do with the Iowa Hazelnut Project is to get on-farm research plantings established on all these different landforms. And so we're going to start off up there in Northwest Iowa with the Northwest Iowa Plains. Now, this is really characterized by moderate to thick loess over what we call glacial till. And then it has gently rolling terrain and a really integrated drainage network. And so that has led to these really well-established branching network of streams that reaches all over Northwest Iowa. And it does provide a really effective drainage system and these really, I guess you could say, uniformly creased land surfaces, if I could maybe explain it that way. And so most of the valleys are going to be these wide swales that are going to gradually merge with these long, even slopes to these in-stream or interstream, I should say, divides. And so this really uniform density of drainage is important, because this is where and this is maybe a little bit technical, and I'm sorry, but I geek out on some of this stuff. But this is where what they call the pre-Illinoisan and then the Wisconsinan glacial deposits occur at the land surface. And so, example, the western half of the region are these uplands, and they are underlain, I should say, by this pre-Illinoisan glacial till that's been just stripped away of their paleosols. But when you look at the eastern half of the region, the tills are covered by these younger glacial deposits. And so then this is that sheet of glacial drift. They call it the Sheldon Creek Formation, and it links this Northwest Iowa Plains to that Wisconsin and glacial advance that you can see with the Des Moines lobe, obviously, which is the one just in the map here in the upper left-hand corner. The Des Moines lobe is the one that's right next to it to the right or to the east. And so that Sheldon Creek drift, they call it, is also of the same age as the Wisconsin formation that was deposited during that earlier glacial episode. And what's really cool is they've done carbon dating in different places to essentially get the age of this older ice. And it's been about 20 to 30 years ago, which is roughly 6 to 16,000 years earlier than that Des Moines lobe, again, which is the one on the right. And because it's so much older, this Sheldon Creek Formation, it really continues eastward beneath the Des Moines lobe and extends at least as far as western Franklin County, where you can actually see it in a quarry by Dow's along the Iowa River. And again, these glacial advances that deposited that Sheldon Creek drift, it took place just before that Wisconsin climate event that I told you about. And so that's when we had things at their coldest. That's just right before you had these massive loess deposits from the Loess Hills. And essentially, this was an ice-free tundra vegetated landscape. And so, again, just fascinating, this Northwest Iowa plain where you have this glacial till. So, and what great graphics, incidentally, too. So I want to share those. These are from the book Landforms of Iowa, which is a really nice book you can Google and take a look at, because it's just really helpful to know where we live and a little bit about where we live. Okay, so on to the Des Moines lobe, and this is where I live. So this is our next landform. I'm really familiar with it because I live up there in northern Kossuth County, right above where you see Algona Advance on the graphic on the upper right-hand corner. I live just kind of in the middle of the county there, in northern Kossuth County. Okay, let's talk about the characterization of this landform. So it's fresh glacial till laid down about 12 to 14,000 years ago. Very poor surface drainage, kind of composed of these small depressional areas that give it its name, the prairie pothole region. You might have heard that term. This is the Des Moines lobe, and it's part of the state that was last touched by these huge sheets of frozen water that invaded our state. And this, of course, last glacial episode occurred about 12 to 14,000 years ago. And again, I'm going to geek out a little bit here, but glaciers are one of the really cool geologic processes that affect the Iowa landscape. And so most of the deposits underlying today's land surface are composed of materials known as drift that were moved here by these glaciers. And the arrival of these glaciers in the state began over 2 million years ago. And they've had numerous reappearances, and they're recorded in different deposits that they leave behind. For all of this massive effort, only the landscapes of north central Iowa still really kind of display the actual shapes that resulted from glacial action. And you can see them again on this graphic where you have these different advances, and they've really left on the landscape these patterns that we observe in the Des Moines lobe. And so they're really related to what we call those end moraines, and these curved concentric bands of ridges and kind of hummocky terrain outline the extent of the last ice advance on the position of the margin and the stagnant ice masses, and that's how they get this buildup and then this defined edge here. And so this pattern of alignment that's kind of parallel with the outline of the lobe shows that the origins were closely associated with that changing ice margin. Again, the idea here being that as the ice retreated, it really melted and left these huge deposits that are kind of visible with the bands that you see there. But not only that, you get then the peat and these really cool peat. It's a really natural part of our glacial history, and that was often accumulated in these smaller like ponds or sloughs, or the bogs. Think of that, where a lot of the plant material could not really completely decompose. And so you had these peat deposits that occurred in fens. Fens are one of the really unusual wetland types that we have. And at these isolated hill slope sites, this is where groundwater seeps to the land surface and has basically maintained permanently saturated deposits of peat for thousands of years. And I find that fascinating. So these, I guess you could think of them as like spring fed habitats. They really have this unique wetland ecosystem that supports a really cool range of interesting fauna and animals and stuff like that. So um, an example, I guess, might be Silver Lake Fen Preserve. That's up in Dickinson County, the Iowa Great Lakes there. And it's a really good example of this really, I think it's a unique and geological phenomena, really. But okay. This habitat, the prairie pothole region, fantastic wetland habitat. This is where we had tons of ducks and geese and all sorts of fowl, pardon me. But it really does have an incomplete surface drainage system because it's so fresh. And that means that it really impacts productivity of agriculture because we have these really wet, heavy soils. And so many of the wetlands were essentially drained as ag became more and more prominent. I mean, we have millions of acres of perforated tile line underneath our landscape in Iowa. And so today, these low spots where it's poorly drained, we have these dark colored soils where you can obviously tell that's where water would pond up and organic matter would accumulate. We also have these glacial erratics. This is a specific term for, wait for it, rocks. So if you ever want to sound smart and you use another term for rock, you can call it a glacial erratic. Anyways, so these rocks are strewn all across the landscape there, and they're usually in my neck of the woods. They're carefully gathered up because you pick your fields for rocks and you go put them in the corner of the field somewhere. You could take a trip to Lone Rock, Iowa, actually, not far from where I live, and visit the large boulder that gave the town its name, and it's proudly displayed at Railroad Park. So, yes, a little bit of trivia. There is actually a rock in Lone Rock. Oh, we got a couple folks in the chat here. Thanks, Clayton. So, clearing fields of rocks, laying these tile lines beneath this poorly drained landscape, it's really turned the Des Moines lobe into a highly productive breadbasket. And so if you look at satellite images taken of Iowa from space, especially in the spring of the year, you can see this really sharp contrast between the intense cultivation of the productive wetland and prairie soils of the Des Moines lobe, and then the different land use patterns on the varied soil types of the surrounding landforms. So we just really heavy agriculture. I mean, all of Iowa is heavy agriculture with row crops. Don't get me wrong, but it seems to be that there's almost less up here in the prairie pothole region. But a lot of that's changing too with CRP. We've got a lot of programs that are actually allowing some of these native areas to be put back into perennials, and of course that's beneficial because then they have roots in the ground all year long. Okay, moving on, and my slide's not moving. There we go. The Iowan surface. And this might be one of our most interesting landforms, characterized by this gently rolling terrain, kind of this thin, spotty loess or loam over this glacial drift. You can see actually the bedrock from the surface in some areas, and it has these kind of scattered glacial boulders. You can see that in the picture in the upper right-hand corner there. This landform was actually the focus of a lot of scientific controversy until some new research methods, and then this concept of stepped erosion came to be in the 1960s to really challenge the generally accepted existence of a separate sheet of Wisconsin glacial drift in this area. So that was kind of interesting. Now, the physical characteristics of this landform, we're talking about gently rolling slopes, really low relief. I would say these open views to the horizon. And this really contrasts with kind of the sight lines of the more billowy, steeply rolling landscapes of the southern Iowa drift plain just to the south. But like southern Iowa, these hill slopes of the Iowan surface, they do have this multi-leveled or kind of stepped surface. And these levels, and they're kind of subtle, they occur in a gradual progression from the major stream valleys up and outward. And so that's how you can tell these drainage divides, incidentally. And it's difficult to pick out some of these clearly defined valley edges. More often when you look at it, your eyes just kind of will go up the slope, right? And then the slope will just kind of imperceptibly merge with the next watershed divide. And so in this landscape, we do have well-established drainage networks, though it's in the middle part of the life of stream life. And so it's more of these slow gradients, I guess that you could say. And there are some wetlands available as well in this Iowan surface. Soils, this is interesting because, and incidentally, Trees Forever had a really cool presentation, and I can link that to you guys in a follow-up email on part of this land surface. Pahas, the Paha region. These are, well, I'm going to send you the link. He does a much better job of explaining it than I do. But these Pahas have different permeability between the loess and some of the sand. And so then these hydrologic conditions produce these kind of hillside seeps. And so you get the water that'll actually come out of the hillside. And it's just really kind of a unique situation. But again, I'll link to that fascinating talk that he gave on these Pahas that are in that Iowan surface there. So more to come, more to come. I'm going to wet my whistle here real quick. I feel like I'm going on and on. Okay, now we get to northeast Iowa, and being from the prairie pothole region where I live, where everything is just flat as a pancake, I love going to northeast Iowa, where my old college roommate's from. The bluffs, the forests, all of it. So this is really that rugged, deeply carved terrain that we see. It's called the Paleozoic Plateau, and it's just unlike anything else in the state, and it just contrasts so much to the rest of the state. And obviously, the most striking parts are these outcroppings of rock, almost no glacial deposits, these really deep and narrow valleys that contain really this cool, almost fast flowing stream and air as well. I was fascinated at visiting some sites where it was just so much cooler right next to the edge of some of these bluffs because of the wind convection that takes place. And just amazing. Now you're also going to get a lot of erosion though because of this exposed rock, and so the bedrock is right there, and it's particularly susceptible to things like pollution. And so we don't, because there's very little glacial material over the top of this bedrock. When we start putting things onto the landscape, it's very easy to get into this karst topography. This has some really unique and diverse flora and fauna, including some really species that are normally found in much cooler and more northern climates. Um, I have somewhere here. Hold up. Okay, so Samuel Kelvin, one of Iowa's best known 19th century geologists, spoke of this scenic landscape as the Switzerland of Iowa. Who would have thought that Iowa or parts of it could be considered similar to Switzerland? But, anyways, um, so the key to this refreshing difference in appearance from the rest of the state are these shallow Paleozoic sedimentary bedrocks that no other region of the state has. This includes fossil rocks from the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, and the Devonian age, which originated as sediments that accumulated on this seafloor basically 300 to 500 million years ago. And so over the course of geologic time, these deposits really hardened into this brittle rock that later were deformed and fractured by just tectonic plate movement. And then we get this widespread series of vertical cracks that extend through the rock. You get these features called joints, and they're responsible for this blocky kind of shape and the sheer faces that you'll see along the rock bluffs and road cuts. That's where it's really evident when you're just driving along some of those roads, and it's obvious. It's right there. Um, and then this area is also known as the driftless area, incidentally, of northeast Iowa, kind of southeast Minnesota, southwest Wisconsin. And this is really a prime area for the expansion of hazelnuts and other agroforestry crops, basically. Well, that is if you can keep the deer at bay, because they've got a lot of deer, I can assure you. But the reason that it's important to look at some perennial crops in this area, because there's so little topsoil there anyways, we don't necessarily want to be turning that over for annual crops. And plus the steep slopes can contribute to soil erosion. And so if we can get roots in the ground all year long to keep the soil in place and not require annual tillage, that would be a real bonus. So. Okay, let's talk just real quickly about this, the alluvial plain. And again, I'm a geek, but I am always amazed at the power of water. And water in motion is one of the most timeless processes that can really have profound impacts on the landscape. And for landlocked Iowans that are far removed from the sight and sound of the oceans, this strong, silent flow of a large river, in my mind, has kind of its own soothing and enduring feeling. And Iowa has hundreds of small brooks and creeks that you can just cross with a big long jump or some stepping stones. But it's time that we look closely at some of these large and small drainage ways, because they really demonstrate the most significant geological process that's presently at work on the landscape. So we had the glaciers in the past, and there's no doubt that they impacted our landscape. But the glaciers are gone, and so we're really dealing with their remnants. But right now, it's water and the action of water that's really at work shaping the characteristics in the landscape of Iowa. And so rivers construct these distinctive flat-floored corridors known as the alluvial plains, which are then underlain by these water-transported deposits. So think of silt, right? And so these topographic corridors weave through the state and the other landform regions, but together they all come together and they contribute to the alluvial plains. And so during the tens of hundreds of thousands of years since the glaciers melted, rivers have carved the state's valleys, partially filled them in with deposits of gravel, sand, silt, and clay. The streams that are draining Iowa's land surface today range in size from just small little rills, really, on upland slopes to, of course, the broad Missouri and Mississippi lowlands that are along the state's western and eastern borders. But basically, only these largest segments of the alluvial plain region stand out at a scale map. The other smaller drainage networks certainly transfer water, sediment from the highest portions of the watershed downslope into the larger streams and rivers, but often aren't really necessarily seen at the landscape level. But eventually, it's all going to go down the Mississippi River or the Missouri to end up in the Mississippi Delta and the Gulf of Mexico. So the alluvial plains always in motion, always carving things. And of course, this is where we're going to get a lot of flooding along those cities that are situated there, which we're all too familiar with, both with the Missouri and the Mississippi. Okay, so the Luss Hills, so unique. Today, basically, the Luss Hills only exist in Iowa and in a couple of locations in China, and that's it. So just a really unique landscape. So the irregular Luss Hills really form one of the distinctive boundaries of our state to the west. They extend in this kind of narrow band that borders the full length of the Missouri River Valley in western Iowa, and it's really in the heart of the deep Luss landscape. Within 2 to 10 miles of the Missouri River Valley, really, that this topography with the sharp features, with the alternating peaks and the saddles that kind of dip and climb along these, I guess these kind of ridge crests, you could say. And then there's these these like side spurs, I guess you could call them, that they branch off the main ridges. And then the steeper slopes of both are often horizontally scored with these like stair step like steps and this dense network of drainage ways that has these hollow, really narrow ravines, and then these steep-sided gullies that help to carve the terrain. It's really cool to see as you're driving through that part of the state. The western boundary of this area is really abrupt and is almost as distinct as a coastline, really. The bluffs are steeply pitched. You have these wooded back slopes. Once you get beyond on the backside, the east side, a lot of timber. They're kind of these flatline cultivated fields as it gradually slopes down from the Missouri River Valley there, and some really nice vistas to look out over when you look at the Luss Hills. The eastern boundary then of the Luss Hills, again, just gradually kind of merges with the southern Iowa drift plain. And speaking of the southern Iowa drift plain, last but not least, this is perhaps most representative of what you might quote the maybe typical Iowa landscape. It's what most folks are going to see as they move from east to west or west to east on Interstate 80. So the Grant Wood, incidentally, the noted artist, he emphasized that the steeply rolling character of this landscape is what he used in many of his paintings, especially the young corn. That's a really famous one, and then the fall plowing. And so the landforms of this region, like the Des Moines lobe, are composed primarily of glacial drift. But the unique thing here is the massive ice sheets that carried material into this part of Iowa were older by hundreds of thousands of years than those that occupied the Des Moines lobe. So it's this, really, if you think about this geological generation gap, that makes all the difference in the appearance between the Des Moines lobe and then the southern Iowa drift plain. So features found in the Des Moines lobe, like the freshly glaciated landscape, have just been obliterated by time. So the moraines, the kettles, the bogs, the lakes, all of those distinctive clues from the glacial time period, they're gone. And so the only remaining evidence of these is the tens to hundreds of feet of glacial drift that then covers the bedrock surface. But instead of poorly drained, which we have in the lobe in north central Iowa, we have these streams that have had plenty of time to establish, We have a really well-connected drainage system, and then these streams have really carved deeply into the land surface. And so hill slopes, especially those higher in the drainage network, often have these etched rills or these ribbed or furrowed appearances. And then these rills will give way to just a little bit bigger ravines, which will give way to a little bit bigger creeks that may or may not flow all year. And they'll eventually give into perennial streams, then rivers, and so on and so forth until you get to the big Mississippi. So it's really almost like a leaf. And incidentally, you can see that if you look at that upper right-hand corner, that picture, that pattern like branching, almost like veins in a leaf. It really shows where that the post-glacial wetlands and some of those things were just erased through time because we've had rivers that have then carved the landscape and incised into those lusts and paleosols. So, okay. I've gone through all of the landforms of Iowa. Sorry to geek out on you just a little bit there, but I think it's important because Iowa is so unique. And one of the things that we want to do is really take that into consideration in the work that we do with the Iowa Hazelnut Project so that we're getting the full picture of what hazelnut production might look like across the entire state. And so speaking of that, you can see on this map, we've overlaid the landforms of Iowa over the counties, and then we put some stars where we have existing sites. And so here you can see in the far western Iowa, we have the Kingsley Pearson FFA Hazelnut Test Plot. Over in Kingsley, Iowa, we have a hazelnut test plot that'll be going in this spring over by Galva, Iowa. Then in north central Iowa, we have the Struker Research Joint Performance Trial. And then we have the Roger Jensen Hazelnut Test Plot. We move to the east. We have the Dell Lawrence Joint Performance Trial, and that's by Marion in the Iowan surface. And then we have one that was just established here last spring near Oxford in Iowa City. And that's just on the edge of that Iowan surface and the southern Iowa drift plain. Another one that's being established here by Williamsburg, Parnell, right along Interstate 80. And then, of course, way down south in Appanoose County at Centerville, we have at Indian Hills Community College, one of our research sites there. Incidentally, that site at the Indian Hills Community College is our overall Iowa Nut Growers Association research test plot, and it has many things growing there, from black walnuts to hickories, pecans, what else? Chestnuts are down there, pawpaws, persimmons, hazelnuts, all sorts of different things. And we certainly each year have a fall field day down there. So stay tuned for more information on that coming up sometime in October of 2023. Okay, so let's talk just real briefly about a couple of these joint performance trials. So we have the Struker research site located in northern Kossuth County, and this is going to be composed of two main soil types, Webster clay loam and then the Coland clay loam. Both of these are poorly drained, really heavy soils that are representative, honestly, of soil types that are going to be found throughout the Des Moines lobe. So these might not be the ideal soils in the ideal site to grow hazelnuts, but what it is a representative site of what we can expect in the prairie pothole region here. And so it's important to essentially be testing them not only in the ideal conditions and the ideal soils where they're well drained, but in what some of those common soils might be. And so here you can see on the left-hand side there some of the potted plants, the Beast and the Grand Traverse, and then some of the bare root dormant plants that might have come from Grimo's Nut Nursery or the University of Minnesota. That's the research site there. We have those plants spaced 10 feet between plants, 15 feet between rows, with a piece of landscape fabric there, and then mulch on top of it. Better picture there. And then much thanks to our collaborators, Chris and Dean Struker, for providing the site and being just great supporters of hazelnuts and agroforestry overall. That's one of the plants there that is almost more of a single-stemmed tree type hazelnut versus the multi-stemmed. We'll get more into this site and some of the stuff that's planted there, but it does have, I think we're up to almost 20 different genotypes being tested there. So. Okay, let's talk about the Del Lawrence research site. This is in Marion. This is about 40 minutes north of Iowa City. The main soil type there is this Judson silty clay loam, which is very deep, well drained. Here's the deal. When I go to Dell's, it's awesome working in his soil. It's mealy, well drained, just top-notch stuff. And so with Dell, we have over 25 different experimental genotypes growing there. To see how well they do, what sort of yields we can expect. You can see some of the size of some of these bare root dormant plants that we established, and just look at some of those root systems, just huge. Here's Dell. Dell has a nice site between a creek bottom, which would be to his right or to the left in this picture, and then a small woodlot, again, to the right to his left on the picture, and then he lives just up the slope, up the hill. It's his property. There's a really nice picture of the site now, all mowed up with plants that are some of them 4 or 5 feet tall. You can see we've got the cages around them, and then of course the tree tubes around some of the smaller plants. But a really nice site right there in the Cedar Rapids, Iowa City area. And there is the man, the myth, the legend, Dell. And this year was a milestone year because I wish I had a drum roll or something here. Well, because thank you. Our first nut. Dell had his first nut this year that we found. And not only that, I think there were a total of 12 plants in that research planting that had at least one nut this year. And so we were very pleased. Again, some of those were established back in 2017. Others more recently as 2019 or 20, but the fact that we finally got some production was just really, really exciting. So I want to touch base here just a little bit on some upcoming classes. So we're going to be meeting basically weekly here, Fridays. You can see the different topics we're going to be going over. Next week is going to be just a hazelnut primer, the good, the bad, the ugly, and just get it all out there. Information on just the basics of hazelnuts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's really self-explanatory. Then we're going to move into planning. Then from planning, we're going to move into, okay, I've already got plants. What sort of planting and maintenance should I be looking at? Maybe I'm coming up on harvesting. So what should I be expecting on the harvesting front? Different size and scales, equipment, how to go about it, so on and so forth. Processing. These are going to require some sort of processing, even if it's to get the husk, the fleshy husk, off of the round in-shell nut. So at the very least, there's going to be that step. And then depending on what level of processing you want to get into with actually cracking things, that's a whole nother level, but we'll talk about that. And then finally, we'll kind of wrap things up with some marketing, some record keeping, a little bit on food safety. And then we will be utilizing an enterprise worksheet that I put together and a 20-year financial model that I put together as part of a document called the Landowner's Guide to Perennial Crop Options. And so that's something I can also include a link with as a follow-up to those folks that are on with us. So I will do that. I also want to make this little pitch here. So we have what's called the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Growers Conference that is done every year, the first weekend in March. And we rotate it between Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. And Iowa will be hosting this year, this coming Friday, March 3rd, and Saturday, March 4th at the Hotel Winneshiek in Decorah, Iowa. We just got the registration page up today on the Trees Forever website, so I will include that in a link if you're interested. The way that these are typically structured is Friday will be maybe a processing demonstration depending on how much interest we get. Most likely we'll have what we call show and tell on Friday night, where folks can schedule a 10 or 15 minute time slot, to just share what they've got going on at their farm. If they've just started to process, if they've got some processing equipment they've been building, anything really. One year, somebody gave a nice tour, or pardon me, a nice presentation on a trip they took to Spain, where they learned about the hazelnut industry there. It could be anything you want. And then on Saturday, that's when we have basically a full day of really heavy hitters, some real experts working on hazelnuts, folks from the University of Minnesota, University of Wisconsin, giving updates on everything from genetics and propagation to new plant cultivars, branding, pest and disease issues, you name it. So be there or be square. Then we also have the Iowa Nut Growers. As an organization, we do what's called a nut evaluation every year. And so anybody from the state can submit samples, nut samples, and then there's a process for processing and scoring nut samples. And so that's a way we've been doing this since 1965. And it's really a way for growers to send in some of their prize nuts to see the percent kernel, how much you can actually they yield, so on and so forth. And so we have scoring criteria for black walnuts, hickories, both shellbark and shagbark, pecans, butternuts, hazelnuts, all sorts of different species. So I can include some information on that as well if folks are interested in submitting samples or just seeing what that's all about. We'll be over in Marion, Cedar Rapids area on Saturday, February 18th. And then since both of you are new, I'd make a pitch for the Iowa Nut Growers Association to become members. Our annual meeting will be coming up here sometime in April. And then we've got a couple of different events that we're looking to get on the calendar real soon. One of them will be a grafting workshop where you'll actually be able to come and practice your grafting and learn how to make various grafts. We'll be doing some bench grafting, that means indoors, and then we'll also be doing some field grafting at a site by Iowa City where there's actually plants in the ground, and we'll be top grafting them. Again, that'll be coming up this spring. There'll also be an opportunity for a pruning workshop, a hazelnut pruning workshop in the Des Moines area sometime this spring, as well as a field day up at my place in northern Kossuth County, where we'll be doing a pruning workshop as well as a planting, so you can get a feel for what a planting is like, how to establish plants, so on and so forth. So a lot of great opportunities coming up here this spring, and some field days that'll be coming up here this summer as well. So stay tuned. And if you're interested to become a member, that would be cool. Let's see here. What is next? Oh, I bet you guys didn't know it, but it's quiz time. Okay, quiz time. So I want to know, and actually I'm gonna bring my camera back here. So I want to know, what is the goal of the Iowa Hazelnut Project? And I'll give you just a second there. Is it one, to grow the biggest nuts, to advance breeding efforts? Are we looking to enhance profitability to the farm family, accelerate hazelnuts in Iowa sustainably, do research demonstration and value-added opportunities for growers? Any thoughts, Clayton or Ed?
All of the above. How about number 3?
Accelerate hazelnuts in Iowa sustainably. And the survey says, oh, that was anticlimactic. Come on, what's wrong with my advance? There it is. That's not right. I screwed it up. You are correct. It is number 3. That's the one that should have been highlighted and bolded.
That was great.
This will be fun. Okay, let's try another one. This one isn't multiple choice. What landform of Iowa do you live in? And so I live in the Prairie Pothole region, in the Des Moines Lobe. Clayton, you said you were in Clarion. So
I think that's Des Moines Lobe too.
Guessing you're either going to be in the Lobe or right next to it. Now, Ed, you're in Clinton. Now, is that a river town right along the Mississippi?
Yes.
So maybe you would be in the alluvial the alluvial plain?
I think that's south. And that largest section all the way across the state.
Okay. So maybe the either the Iowan surface or maybe just the southern Iowa drift plain, probably. So
Yes.
okay, interesting. Okay. So next, name one of the joint performance trial locations. Are we looking at Wilcox, Leicester, Marion, Farragut, Ames, Iowa City, Fenton, or Sioux City?
Marion.
Marion, there's a guess. Any guesses from Clayton? And
I thought the joint performance, I thought the big spot was Indian Hills Community College for growing all the different stuff, but I don't see a Tumwa on that map, so, or on that multiple choice.
So very perceptive. And in Centerville, Indian Hills does have an Atemo campus. This one is the Centerville campus down in Appaloosa. And it's not on there, but that would be an acceptable answer. So ding, ding, ding for you. And the other two would be Marion at the Del Lawrence site and then the Fenton site up here in North Central Iowa.
Cool.
Okay. So next question. What is the largest landform of Iowa by size? Any guesses there?
What was the name of that artist? Who?
Grant Woods. Yep.
Yeah, I'm guessing it's that one. Whatever he drew pictures of for that one.
The Southern Iowa Drift Plain. Yes, indeed. So that, again, the typical landscape of Iowa, what most folks would see passing through along Interstate 80, the Southern Iowa Drift Plain. Okay, last one here. Oh, that was the last one. Never mind. So there's my contact information. Let's just open it up to questions, comments. What do you want to know?
I got
go ahead. First vineyard in Oxford, Iowa, back in the 70s. Where is the grower located at?
So the nut evaluation will be in the offices of Trees Forever. And that's coming up here again in February. And then a couple of the other events, the grafting workshop, we don't have the details yet.
The site in Oxford, Iowa.
Oh, Oxford.
Oxford, yeah.
Yeah.
It was right on Highway 6 between the two Oxford exits.
Oh, so this is Connie Aldridge. That's actually on just outside of Iowa City. And so she has a site there that she just established last spring. And so this will be her first full year. And in fact, I'm hoping to have a field day there this summer because some of those plants that we put in there were actually planted at Indian Hills Community College back in 2020, and then we dug them up. So they were relatively mature plants. Some of them had catkins on them. And so male catkins is going to be the male pollen shedders. So there's a chance that she might actually even have some production this coming year, 2023. So that would be exciting.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, I had to find his vineyard and nursery back in 1996. First commercial in Iowa.
Okay. Very cool.
That's awesome. I guess I got a question.
Sure.
A lot of these plants that I bought from the West Coast, you think they'll grow in Iowa?
I'm not optimistic in the long term.
Okay. It said on the grow map that Iowa was well within the region, even into southern Minnesota. But I know that, well, I guess I don't know anything. That's why I'm here. But, I'll be interested to see if they grow.
Well, so here's where we kind of get the stuff that they have out in Oregon. It is, first of all, it is EFB resistant, but it's EFB resistant to the EFB, Eastern Filbert Blight, that they have there. And one of the things that we've discovered is that EFB, Eastern Filbert Blight, it's almost like it has flavors. And so their EFB is a little bit different than RFB, EFB, which might be a little bit different than the EFB out in the East Coast with like Rutgers and stuff like that.
Lovely. So different types of EFB depending on the country, the part of the country you live in.
Yeah, yeah. So what that means is, first of all, the cold hardiness can be an issue where those plants coming from a more temperate climate in Oregon and in the Pacific Northwest come here to our pretty harsh Iowa winters. So here's just a real quick side. This is going to be a test winter for us because when we had that cold spell where it was basically like minus 20 to 30 degrees below zero, but for like 3 days straight with the wind that was roaring through here, like I expect to see a lot of dieback, and so that's going to be a test one for us. And so that can be an issue, dieback for some of those plants. The other issue can be that the male catkins will actually freeze off. And of course, if you don't have male catkins and you don't have pollen, one of the things that other growers have done to address that is, okay, I'll just get my pollen, quote unquote, pollen from seedlings in the Midwest here to be the pollen source then for pollinating then those European varieties from Oregon. And so they've got some plants from, excuse me, from Oregon in Nebraska that they're experimenting with. Dave Bonoff, he's a retired professor from the University of Wisconsin who's very active with that group up there. He has Jefferson and Yamhill both, I'm almost sure, in his plantings, and he's starting to see where they're starting to succumb to some of the cold hardiness issues there and stuff. But as zones are moving with climate change, who knows, essentially. So I think it's cool that you're experimenting with it because it really can't hurt.
Thanks. Hopefully they live and we can buy some more. If not, you have a good recommendation of places to buy in the Midwest?
Well, one of the things I would ask is what you're interested in, like what level. Maybe you'd like to get involved with the Iowa Hazelnut Project and do a small research planting. In that case, 5 plants. We'd like to do maybe 5 replications, so 25 total plants. And then if you had seedlings on each end, but anyways, you could get access to some of the experimental genotypes that we have through the University of Minnesota and through the Wisconsin growers and stuff like that. Some other areas where you can just purchase plants, but they're going to be clonal is Grimo's Nut Nursery in Canada. That's Ernie and Linda Grimo. And so we have quite a few of their selections that are in our on-farm trials. So Marion, Aldara.
Did you say Marion?
Yeah, that's the name of one of their varieties. Yeah,
that is wild. That's the name of the farm.
exactly. Yeah, Marion, Aldara, Andrew, Frank, and there's a couple more that they're experimenting with. So
that's great.
And you can purchase them right now. They're online. You can find out they've got some really good stuff. Again, they're in Canada, so they've got their seedlings are a little bit pricier because they've got to get through customs. But they can do it. They do it to all over the United States, and they have a long track record of it. So they have all the necessary permits, so on and so forth.
I think it'd be great to do a little test trial plot for Iowa Nut Growers Association. I think that'd be awesome.
Let's talk more, and I'll send you some information because it's a lot of fun, and we're always looking for more sites, and we all learn together. So
cool. Thanks.
Yeah. What else? Oh, I went off this side tangent talking about. Well, did I answer your question? I guess, Clayton. Maybe that's where I should start.
Oh yeah, you answered my question.
Okay.
I think my question around what the best variety. I when I was looking up that Willis Orchard, it looks like it was the University of Oregon that came up with those hybrids, and out of like the Eastern Fieldright, the blight.
Yeah.
So I think we're good. I think we're good. What I'm understanding is there's a lot of different varieties of hazelnut trees to buy, and it sounds like the hazelnuts in Iowa are kind of in its infancy. The future is nuts, as I think that's what the slogan was. So that sounds good to me. I'm down to test out a couple, and it's a fairly small plot, and it's on a southern facing hillside, and we're going to put a house there and grow some fruiting tree, I
Nice.
think nuts would be the way to go. So it'd be fun to kind of be part of a larger experiment and contribute to that. So yeah,
Cool,
that's
cool.
cool.
So, real quick on hazelnuts, and don't get me started, I could go all day, but I'll try to be brief. So, Oregon State University. So, they are the premier organization working with hazelnuts in the United States. They have been breeding hazelnuts since the 1950s. And of course, their growers are almost entirely in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. The Willamette Valley is an amazing place because they can grow a multitude of different crops. I think they grow like 15 different crops from hazelnuts to huckleberries to alfalfa to all sorts of different things. But without a doubt, they're the premier university that's been working on hazelnuts. Sean Mellenbacher's their main researcher. They developed what's called the gas away gene, which is a single gene that initially got them resistance to Eastern filbert blight, but they are most definitely interested in other forms of resistance to Eastern filbert blight, recognizing the need for multiple vectors instead of a single gene, because Mother Nature will eventually get around that. So that's why they've been interested in working with us in the Midwest here, because in the Midwest, we have what's called the American hazelnut, Corlus americana, more of a shrub, multi-stemmed shrub, much smaller nuts, much thicker shells, but American hazelnuts here have co-evolved with Eastern filbert blight for thousands of years. And so there is what's called a novel, or what we call novel resistance or tolerance to EFB that they're very interested in terms of breeding efforts. And then finally, the last big player that's it's important to mention is Rutgers University out in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And just real quickly there, their claim to fame was that they had a professor called Reed Funk who led their turf grass program. And through turf grass breeding, a lot of the turf grass that you will find on NFL fields and soccer fields and baseball stadiums originated with some of their work. And because of that, and some of their breeding work with turf grass, they were flush with money from royalties from the turf grass work. So they shifted their gear, or their view, I should say, to nuts. And they did a systemic review of, okay, how could we make an impact with breeding of nuts? And so they looked at all of the different nuts, from walnuts to pecans to hazelnuts, and decided that the most good and the most progress could be made with hazelnuts. So they've now devoted a lot of the research and money to Rutgers. Sean Molnar, or pardon me, Tom Molnar, the researcher there, has actually gone over to Europe and done a little tour of former Soviet countries like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, even been into Russia, Turkey, places where hazelnuts are, even on roadside stands. He would find stuff that was interesting from universities that were doing research, brought all of that material back to Rutgers, started to screen it for Eastern filbert blight, again, looking for cold hardy genetics, and then genetics that would be resistant to Eastern filbert blight, developed 3 unique strains, and some of that work is being developed and bred into some of the hazelnuts. And of course, they have now 4 selections that they're looking to release for what are considered mid-Atlantic growers, basically from the Carolinas up to New Jersey. And so they've got a group of growers that they're working with there. And now they've combined forces. So Oregon State out west, uh, New Brunswick, New Jersey, with Rutgers in the east, and then the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and then the University of Missouri, their agroforestry center. They've all come together with this hazelnut consortium, which is this other group that's really trying to take hazelnuts and develop them as a viable agroforestry crop in the United States here. And so that's a group that's a little bit different than our upper Midwest group, which is kind of University of Minnesota, University of Wisconsin, some other different nonprofits. Of course, we all work together. In fact, we're all looking to do a big proposal to the government for like $5 million for continued breeding and stuff like that. So, again, I could talk all night, but just a
That's
little bit of
fantastic.
context
That's
of
really
where
cool.
we're at with stuff. So
That's great background. Just some of the history on the Eastern filbert blight and where it comes from, and how the American hazelnut has evolved with it, kind of the natural resistance. That's awesome. And did I get the name right? Funky, the old turf grass company, Funky.
Um,
What was that guy's name?
no.
NFL royalties?
Yeah, so it was it Carl Funk?
Funk. Carl Funk.
But it's not Funky Seeds. So essentially what they did was a lot of the research in the breeding, and then where that stuff is grown, incidentally, is way up in northern Minnesota, in Roseau County, Minnesota, by the
Oh,
Canadian border. That's like the number one place for turf grass production. And so they grow it, they harvest it, and then that goes out again to these ball fields all over the place because of the characteristics of it and some of the different varieties. Really, really cool, fascinating story. But
awesome. Thanks for that.
it was Reed Funk,
Reed Funk. Thank you.
Funk, Reed Funk out at Rutgers. Yeah, Google
Reed
that.
Funk. I
Cool
will.
story.
And then Tom
Molnar,
Molnar.
Molnar. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Well, I hope this was interesting. I'll send out a link for the next meeting coming up here on Friday. I'll get this one posted if you want to reference back to it. Hey, looking forward to the series.